Tremendous privilege for me to be here with you this morning. My name is Dave Mohr, and I have met just a very few of you, not many to this point. But many of you know Bob Cron, who was the executive area minister for many, many years of the British Columbia Association of North American Baptist Churches. That's a mouthful, isn't it? The BC Association, as we like to call them. When Bob retired, I got a call from a friend who I had been working with for a number of years, and he said, "Hey, this job is coming up. We know Bob is retiring. We know you know Bob, and we know you love Bob, because Bob was a mentor of mine many years ago." And he said, "Would you be interested?" And I thought to myself, well, I kind of look like him. I ride a motorbike, and I believe Bob rode a bike. I know he did. Actually, he visited me once in one of the churches I was pastoring in on his motorbike. And actually, it was at that moment I thought we were kindred spirits. I thought to myself, he might be the coolest old guy pastor I'd ever met. And now I'm one of them. And so, anyway, I took this job after Bob retired. I took it about 5 or 6 months ago. And I'm just now finding myself becoming acquainted slowly with all the churches in our association. And as you can imagine, it's a pretty broad job. It starts from actually just into Washington State all the way to northern BC and everything in between. And so I'm doing a lot of traveling and discovering all sorts of great things about the great people and about the great movement of God in our churches. You see, what I'm discovering, in fact, is this one simple truth, that God refuses to be silent. God says, as He has said from the beginning, we will continue to spread the truth of Jesus Christ. And here's what I want to do. I want to use, God would say, you. You and me. He would love us to be instruments of His grace in the world that we live. You know, whether it's in your workplace, or whether it's here on a Sunday morning, or a midweek study, or a prayer meeting, or it's in that coffee shop, your favorite coffee shop, as you sit there sipping that latte. God says, I would like to use you right there. Isn't that incredible? Out of all the things that God, as powerful as God is, as big as God is, as sovereign as God is, out of all things, He chose to use you and me. God could have done whatever He wanted. But He said, no, I'd like to use my people. I'd like to use my kids to proclaim the news about me. What better instrument of information than the people who have been the recipients of God's unbelievable grace? So if you have your Bible, or if you have an app, or whatever it is you're happening to join us on, or if you're joining us online, welcome. We're so glad you're here. We don't care really how you got here. If you're visiting this morning as well, we're grateful you're here. Maybe you happen to come on your own, or you're a regular, or Grandma invited you, or you took a wrong turn and you ended up in the building. We don't care. We're just grateful you're here, because we believe that when God's people gather like this, then good things happen. So we're going to read from Romans chapter 12, as was read so well earlier today. And if you're a follower of Jesus, if you've been one for a long time, you will know that these verses we're going to read from Romans chapter 12, the first two verses, are some of, in fact, the most familiar verses that you might know or have known for many, many years. So let me just quickly read them again, because I want them to be fresh in our hearts and minds. Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. The word of the Lord. Now notice the first word that we read when we read those first two verses. You notice the very first word in our English we've translated this way, therefore. Whenever you see the word therefore in any passage of Scripture, in any text, you need to ask yourself this question, what is it there for? Just something to remember. So therefore, what is it there for? Why is he saying that at the beginning of this chapter 12? Well, he's saying this. All the stuff that I've written in the first 11 chapters, we're on chapter 12, all the stuff that I've written before that, what I'm going to do now, Paul says, is I'm going to do this. I'm going to call you to that kind of life. And what he says is it's a life that's built on something lasting. It's a life that doesn't come out of nowhere. It's rooted in something. And what is he saying? What is he saying? He said it's rooted in God's mercy. God's mercy. It actually perfectly sums up the truth of God and his relationship with us through Jesus, excuse me, in chapter 1 through 11. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy. So as we begin today, despite the risk of oversimplifying the incredible words of this incredible text, let me attempt an 8-word summary, just a Dave summary for you here this morning of the first two verses. And it's this, ready? Your entire life should be a living sacrifice. Does it sound like a big deal? It is. Does it sound easy? It isn't. What kind of life do I need to live if I'm constantly sacrificing myself? You know, if you ask almost anyone what they think of when they think of religion, they'll say this. They'll say something like, well, it's a belief system. Or they'll say, it's a particular way of living. And if they were to define religion that way, they wouldn't be that far off. See, you live a certain way and you practice certain practices because of what you believe, the belief system. But see, in the ancient world that Paul was writing to here in Romans, religion was thought more in terms of sacrifice. See, religion, as Paul would say, it was about trying to make things right. And you did that then by offering a sacrifice. You do the right things to please the right God, or gods as it were in those days, and you do it in the right way. It's really no different than what all religions are after. Religious behavior, which makes things right. That's sacrifice. See, the problem, though, is Paul, he talks about in the first half of Romans, is that that's what religion does, is what he's saying. But it's not what Jesus is about. Jesus was about this. You don't have to offer sacrifices to make up for your sins anymore. Paul wanted to say this. He wanted us to know this and understand it. It's absolutely critical for us as followers of Jesus to know this truth. Jesus did that once for all. Over. Final. See, if a quick sacrifice is going to just wipe my slate clean, what's my motivation to avoid the next bad decision? It just kind of becomes an abuse, really, of what God intended. And it's actually just one of the problems with the old system of sacrifice and the old system of religious behavior. It kind of comes down to this. A sacrifice without the right heart behind it is a hollow gesture because it's based on an action instead of the heart. In the Old Testament, the prophet Hosea says in his book in chapter 6, verse 6, that rather than offer a hollow or insincere sacrifice, which they did in those days, sacrificial system, God would rather we sincerely treat him and his kids like he does. That's Hosea saying that from the Old Testament. His definition of an acceptable sacrifice has everything to do with the heart more than the action. So that's why Paul says in verse 1. So in view of all that God has done, okay, we're getting a picture of now where God is going, where Paul is going with this. In view of all that God has done, his mercy, those two words, we offer a sacrifice. It'll just be different than the normal sacrifices you get at first glance. See, the difference is it will be you and me. It'll be a living sacrifice. It's a living sacrifice that flows out of a sincere heart. Now, notice we didn't say it flows out of what we say, it flows out of what we do, or even how we say it or how we do it. Paul says this: this is the thing that pleases God. Did you get that? See, if you give away something that you have no stake in or no connection to, that doesn't cost you anything. That's not a sacrifice. It's convenient, but at best it's impersonal. It's the same as an act of sacrifice that comes from an insincere heart. You see, the one thing Paul would say, that if it comes from an insincere heart, the one thing it isn't is worship. Now, there's something really significant about verse 1. But before Paul describes a life of sacrifice as being merciful to others, and the rest of chapter 12 is filled with examples and realities about that, he describes it this way: worship. Now, before we start to think like religion does, okay, that a Jesus follower is all about being merciful to people, realize that it has everything to do with being worshipful to God first. Let's hear that again. Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and this is your proper worship. In other words, in view of God's mercy, your sincere sacrifice needs to be offered to him before we give our mercy to man. We offer ourselves in worship to God. See, a life of sacrifice, Paul would say, is worshipful before it's merciful. This is big. This is so big, but yet it might be fair to say that we miss this so much of the time. If you're a follower of Jesus, then this is specifically for you, this truth. You see, we can never let ourselves drift into mere social agenda. And I say mere social agenda in quotes carefully, because if God is left out of our social agenda, our mercy, it will be just social agenda. Now, that's good. And if you're not yet a follower of Jesus, then let me just tell you, let me encourage you, continue to offer mercy to others. That's a good thing. It's what Jesus did all the time. And he tells us to keep doing it. But this is the truth for followers of Jesus and for anyone else. It can be so much more. See, it's a beautiful thing for anybody to give the hungry something to eat. But how much more beautiful is that when you know that God decided that person you were feeding is worthy of his mercy before you even showed yours? See, Jesus followers, we show mercy out of the value we see in others because of the value God gave them first. Put it this way, the things we do, the sacrifices that flow out of a sincere heart, they're an expression of God's worth. That's why Ebenezer Baptist Church has been where Ebenezer Baptist Church has been for so many years. That's why Ebenezer Baptist Church started on this piece of property so many years ago and continues to exist, because they want to be an expression to the world of God's worth. See, but if all the ways we sacrifice our time, our energy, our resources, if they're not an act of worship first, then in the end, what Paul is saying, we basically won't have actually been merciful. We serve not so that we can be seen, but so others can see Jesus. The defining characteristic of a Jesus follower is a life of worship so that it can be merciful. If we're not worshiping in our behavior, that is, if God's mercy's in us, that is the gift of Jesus Christ, as Paul talks about in Ephesians, the gift of Jesus Christ, as He resides within us. If they don't go hand in hand with our behavior, we're not actually giving people what they need the most. See, this is the thing. The mercy of God is the relentless pursuit of His people, both when they need Him and when they think they don't. That's God's mercy. It's inspiring. It's motivating. It drives us to a life where now we understand when Paul says sacrifice can be an everyday act of worship. It's so much more than what we do on a weekend or in a service. It's not about that one great song, and there were great songs this morning, that transported us into just the right, perfect worship mood. It's more than a one-sentence prayer at morning. It's more than that quick prayer at night with the kids at bed, to go to bed, or before you grab a bite. A living sacrifice, says Paul, carries with it something different, and it's a posture throughout the day. And that posture is one of readiness, one that is bowed, that is tuned into the very same things that God is. See, it's more than a moment. It's more than a song. It's more than a prayer. It's who we are all the time. You know, there have been times in my life when I have said to God, I can't. It's too hard, God. Too distracting. No, God, I think that'll take too long. I would like the result now, so I'm going to do it my own way. Have you ever said things like that to God? Maybe it's that time when you were wrestling through, that issue you just can't seem to get a handle on. You can't seem to get victory over, and you said to God, directly or indirectly, God, I can't. Or maybe it was just following through with the right thing. You knew you were supposed to do it, but you struggled to go all the way, and so you said to God, I can't. It can be so hard, right? Almost impossible. And we almost want to ask the God, every moment, God? Of every day? God, you don't know what my work life is like. You had no idea what my boss is like. He is so hard on me. The expectations are off the charts. I don't know what to do. Living with my family, God? Oh, God, you have no idea what it's like to live with my family. So much pressure. My parents put pressure on, my grandparents put pressure on me, the uncle and aunt, that I've got to be a certain way. God, you have no idea what that's like. Or, God, you don't know this. Do you know that my friends, they have no clue about you or who you are, what you're about? And God, that can be hard. They don't get what I stand for, and so you say to God, I can't, God. You know what I've learned about myself, and that may be true of you as well? It's usually not so much a case of I can't, as much as it is, I just won't. See, for some of us, we don't even like to get to the point of saying I won't, because even before we decide, even before it gets to that point, we decide, I don't know if it's worth it. If we cut right to the heart of the problem, what we discover is simply this, that the heart is the problem. When we let other things take priority over God, those other things become simply the most important thing to us. Where? Right here. Remember the first commandment of the Big Ten, Exodus chapter 20? God says this, you shall have what? No other gods before me. Jesus talked about this all the time. Specifically when it came to how we act in the everyday kind of stuff. In Mark chapter 7:21, Jesus said this, remember, he said, out of man's hearts, he didn't say mouths, out of man's hearts, and he listed a bunch, comes all sorts of things. You see, in those moments, you and I have a choice. We have a choice to live moment by moment, day by day, trying to let my entire life be an act of worship. Parents, I got to ask you this question this morning. What would your relationship with your kids be like if when you were with them, when you were talking with them, you made every conversation an act of worship? Students, hey, do you think your homework would be nearly as tough as if you did it as a way of honoring God? Becoming a steward of the good things that God has given you? Or how about this? Would conflict in your relationships at work or at home, would they be easier or harder for you if you realigned how you talked? If you determined that your conversations, all conversations, would honor God, and you did it because you wanted to worship God. You see, every single part of our day can be an act of worship that pours out of a sincere heart. The struggle can be so immense, but here's the thing, the one thing life teaches: when we don't worship and honor God in all that we do, we will worship something or someone else. And that, despite that there's only one who's actually worthy of our worship. We see it all the time. It's not hard for us to see, looking for new things to worship. That's what a life of sacrifice is about, though. It's about relinquishing my desire to do my own thing and then present that as an offering to God. That is, Paul would say, a living sacrifice. Now, verse 2 of Romans 12 is one of the most quoted verses in the entire Bible, but we should never read it without verse 1 first, because verse 2 is about the how of verse 1. So, verse 1, remember, it says, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. Now, verse 2, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. You see, verse 2 is the how to verse 1. Now, that word conform in verse 2, it's an important one. It's the same word that we get our English word for scheme from. You all know what a scheme is, right? It means we change the look on the outside because the outside seems really important, but we're not really worried about what's on the inside because it's just all about the appearance. We want what other people to think. But that word conformed also means fashioned, to create. You put those two together, scheme and fashion, and you see what Paul is saying is, don't allow yourself to adopt what looks good to this world, focused on all the outside stuff. You know, I remember seeing a commercial many years ago. It was quite a few years ago. I was quite a bit younger, maybe more impressionable, but probably not. I'm kind of the same impressionable guy back as I am now as I was then. But I might have been having insomnia or something, but I got up in the middle of the night and I turned the TV on, and back in those days, they had these things called infomercials. We kind of see them. It's kind of like the QVC channel, but not. And I saw these things, and I got to tell you, I'm not sure if you're familiar with these. These are called push-up helpers. And fortunately, I had the common sense, but it's actually because I'm too cheap. I didn't buy them on the spot. But when I watched this infomercial, I was completely enraptured by this thing because the guy who was explaining them, he was totally ripped. I mean, the guy, he was wearing a t-shirt that you've seen it, where the muscles just bulge out of every possible crease. And I looked at him and I thought to myself, I want that. I want to look just like that guy. And so I couldn't stop thinking about these things. Fortunately, I didn't buy them there, but a couple years later, they came to mind again while I was in a thrift store with my wife, and I saw them, which should have been my first clue, because they were $1.07, and I bought them. And I want to tell you that I use them religiously for at least 3 or 4 push-ups. I don't know if you've ever tried these things before, but I'm not going to kid you. They're incredibly hard, and there's no way I'm trying to demo them right up here with you right now, just in case. And by the way, some of you, I know it, I can tell in your faces, you're judging me right now. And I just want to take a moment to remind you of the Suzanne Summers Thigh Master that you have in your closet. Okay? The treadmill that's folded up, collecting dust in the basement. Yeah, don't forget about that one. Or all you Ab Cruncher Pro people, I know about those too. Actually, I got to tell you, I have found a great use for these. And you know what you do when you're sitting on the couch later at night and you're watching TV. When you go downstairs, I found that this is an incredible little tray. I got a big plate of nachos, and I set this in between the couch cushions right here. And this thing just spins perfectly. It is actually an incredible little feature, and I probably would have bought them for that alone. I'm not going to kid you. You see, the thing is, isn't it kind of a problem we have? We deal with it all the time, you and I. We want to spend a lot of time on the external stuff, start to look a certain way and act a certain way and be a certain way, because we think everybody else thinks it's important. Students, do you get caught up trying to keep up? You have enough TikTok followers? Do you dress and talk the right way? Young moms, you feel the pressure to fit in with all the other young moms? Dads, do you make enough money? Should you quit that job to take this other job? See, the problem is thinking that I just really want people to see me this way, when it really only matters that God sees me His way. You know, woven through the first 11 chapters of Romans, Paul left us, he tells us all about God's mercies, the first 11 chapters, and he clarifies not only who He is, but who we are because of Him. Remember Romans 3:23? We'll never be good enough on our own because of our sin. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Romans chapter 5, verse 8, we see that God's mercy showed us how much He loved us. This verse says, God showed us His great love for us by sending Christ to die for us when? While we were still sinners. Not because of what we looked like at the time. You see, God's mercies, those are the things that make you and I who we are. Who we are is not external. It's internal. It's built completely on what is done in my life through and because of Jesus. Who I am is not built on anything I do or cannot do. Who I am is not built on what I say or cannot say. Who I am is not built on what I have done or have not done. It is only on what He has done and what He continues to do. Now here's why. It's really dangerous for us to define ourselves by anything other than Jesus. And the first reason, it's really practical. When all those things we're holding on to so tightly, they disappear, and they always do, we're left with nothing. And then we see what happens. The process, we're forced to define ourselves by something else new. And that disappears. And we're left with nothing. And we're forced to define ourselves by something new, and we hold tight to it, and then all of a sudden that disappears, and we're left with nothing. But I want to give you the other reason, and it's really dangerous. And it's really the only reason we need to be aware of when it comes to defining who we are. When we define ourselves by anything other than Jesus, what happens is that we begin to hold on to those things so tightly that even though they've disappeared, we still try to hold on. See, living the kind of sacrificial life that God asks is impossible when we're more worried about conforming the outside than transforming the in. You know, I said earlier that the words for scheme and fashion, they come from that same word that Paul used for conform. You know what another English equivalent word for that word transform that comes next is? Metamorphosis. Metamorphosis. Paul was saying, here's what you need to know. When you don't conform to the pattern of this world and you are then transformed by the renewing of your mind, what we see is the change, metamorphosis starts on the inside. We see that that's where it always starts. A life of sacrifice is actually marked, Paul would say, by transformation that starts here on the inside. Interesting fact about transformation. Well, it always starts on the inside. It always shows up on the outside. See, what Paul is doing in Romans chapter 1 and 2, Romans chapter 12, 1 and 2, he's brilliantly showing us that to be a living sacrifice, it flows out of a sincere heart. Paul is brilliantly telling us that this is an everyday act of worship. He's brilliantly telling us that it doesn't conform to what just looks good on the outside, but he's saying it's transformed on the in. The transformation is the result of everything else that came before. See, it's about what God has done for you and I in the past, but now, in the present. And this is what Paul really wanted us to know, is now that he is in present transforming us, he continues to do it on the outside, inside. Oh, the New Living Translation says it this way. It says, let God, 2 words it uses, let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. I think that's actually accurate to what Paul was trying to say. It's saying, if we decide to let God transform us into new people, then it'll happen. It's actually what it all comes down to. It comes down to letting God transform you. Now, I grew up with like many of you, I grew up with a very strong dad. My dad he actually had German roots, for those of you in the ancestry of the NAB. My father was a strong man. I remember as a kid, as a little guy, some of the very first thoughts I ever had about my dad was, wow, he's strong. I saw it throughout my whole life. When we were traveling in the car and we'd have snacks, I would say to my dad, can I have an apple? Because we had usually a few apples for snacks. And I was small, so he would take that apple with his hands and he would just go, and he'd break it in half and hand me half. And I remember thinking, boy, my dad was strong. I remember I was about 10 or 12 years old, and my dad was out in the fields. He was a businessman for many, many years, a contractor, general contractor, and then he decided he would retire and bought a farm, a big farm. And so he was out there in the field, and he was working the field. It was a midsummer Alberta day, and it was about 32 to 35 degrees. And he would demand that he just had the routines, and he couldn't get around them. He would insist that he got his coffee break, his lunch, and then his afternoon coffee break at certain times. So I wasn't old enough quite to get in the field yet, but I would run out there and I'd hand Dad his coffee break, and it was 35 degrees, and he would have coffee. But not iced coffee. There was no McDonald's kind of scenario. No, this was like, it was piping hot. And I remember sitting there watching my dad pour in 35 degree weather this coffee, and it would steam. It was so hot, and he would sip that, and he wouldn't even flinch. And I remember thinking, he's so tough. I watched my dad battle cancer a number of years later. And the doctors saying to him, there's just, you have a very really short window to live. And my dad said, I don't think so. And he lived this long. Oh, my dad was so strong. Many, many years later on his deathbed, I stood beside his deathbed and I held his hand. And he was clearly just moments from passing. His body was just at the point where it was shutting down. And I remember saying to my dad, as a son would, I was close to my dad, I said, "How are you doing, Dad?" And he looked at me and he said, barely get the words out. He said, "I'm doing okay." Oh, my dad was so strong. But you know what else I remember about my dad? When it came to God's word, and that which God had for him, God's plan, God's perfect design for my dad's life, which he was imperfect, just like all of us. But when it came down to that, my dad was soft. I think what it came down to as I reflect and think about my dad in those circumstances, my dad had a good posture. It was not so much about his actions as it was his heart. He had a posture before the Lord that said, "Not my will, Lord, yours be done." You know, our text in Romans is really challenging. We could say, we'd ask these questions: what are my priorities? How do I align those priorities with God's? Do you know what I think it comes down to? Our posture. I think a life of sacrifice for you and I, as Paul would have it, is dependent on our posture. If you're a follower of Jesus, your life should be about something different. What drives you? What motivates you? What guides you? What inspires you? And what changes you? At the end of the service, the ushers are going to have these available to you as you leave the service. And it's a little card that I brought with me. And I'm actually handing them out to every church in our association across British Columbia. And it's called The Prayer of Relinquishment. It was written by Richard Foster in his book, Prayers of the Heart. And I had them printed because I would love it for each one of us to take this with us. If you still use a paper Bible, I kind of hope you do. If you do, and stick it in the front flap of your Bible. Or if you don't, if you're at home, if you have a fridge that'll take a magnet, stick a magnet on this thing. Or if you don't, or if you're on your bedside table or in your bathroom mirror, whatever it is, put this prayer of relinquishment there so you can see it. I'm going to read it for us now. And I wonder if you would just join me and pray this prayer, not so much listen, not so much from our mouths, from our hearts. Today, Lord, I yield myself to you. May your will be my delight today. May your way have perfect sway in me. May your love be the pattern of my living. I surrender to you my hopes, my dreams, my ambitions. Do with them what you will, when you will, and as you will. I place into your loving care my family, my friends, my future. Care for them with a care that I can never give. I release into your hands my need to control, my craving for status, my fear of obscurity. Eradicate the evil. Purify the good. And establish your kingdom on earth for Jesus' sake. Amen.